The Belgian Malinois slammed against the end of its leash so hard that the steel snap cracked through the trauma bay like a gunshot. Every conversation died instantly. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves lay unconscious beneath a warming blanket, his oxygen mask fogging with every shallow breath, while the military working dog planted itself between him and every human in the room. Nobody was getting through. "Back away," the handler shouted, digging both boots into the floor as Atlas surged forward again. One nurse tried anyway. Atlas answered with a warning growl that froze her where she stood. A second nurse approached more slowly. The dog refused her too. Shoulders locked. Eyes fixed. Every muscle delivering the same answer. No. Monitors continued their relentless rhythm beside the bed as the trauma surgeon checked his watch. "If we can't examine him before surgery," he said quietly, "we lose our window." Nobody argued. Every failed attempt stole another precious second. Someone suggested sedating the dog. A military officer shook his head immediately. "Sedate him, and we lose the only protection that soldier trusts." The room fell into the kind of silence that comes only after every obvious solution has already failed. Then someone near the back laughed under his breath. "Try the quiet nurse. She barely talks to patients. She won't last 3 seconds." Emily Carter looked up from the supply cart without answering. She didn't move toward Atlas. She simply watched him. While everyone else stared at the dog's teeth, Emily watched his ears. While everyone focused on the barking, she listened to the pauses between each bark. Then her eyes drifted, not to the dog, but to a stainless steel instrument cart rattling softly beneath an air vent every few seconds. "Could someone stop that tray from shaking?" she asked. Nobody moved. Dr. Ryan Cole smirked. "The problem isn't the tray. The problem weighs 70 pounds and has military training." A few nervous chuckles spread through the room. Emily didn't argue. She walked to the cart, steadied it with one hand, and slid a folded towel beneath the loose wheel. The metallic rattle disappeared. Atlas never stepped away from Reeves. But the barking stopped. Instantly. The sudden silence was so complete that the heart monitor became the loudest sound in the room. Colonel Nathan Brooks slowly lowered the clipboard in his hands. 20 years working with military dogs had taught him the difference between coincidence and behavioral change. Atlas hadn't relaxed because someone controlled him. He had relaxed because someone removed a source of stress before ever approaching him. Brooks shifted his eyes from the dog to the quiet ER nurse, who had already stepped back as though nothing unusual had happened. "Interesting," he murmured. Hope returned almost immediately. "See," Dr. Cole said. "He's calming down." Another nurse reached toward Reeves' foreline. Atlas exploded forward again, blocking her path with another thunderous growl. The brief hope vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Frustration rolled through the trauma bay. Someone quietly suggested canceling the military demonstration. Another officer ordered the sedation kit to be prepared. Brooks said nothing. His attention remained fixed on Emily. She wasn't watching the dog anymore. She was watching the unconscious soldier's breathing, then the exact distance between Atlas' front paws and the hospital bed, as though measuring something no one else could see. "Nurse Carter," Brooks called. Every head turned. Emily hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then, without saying a word, she unclipped the watch from her left wrist and slipped it into her scrub pocket. Atlas saw the movement. For the first time since entering the trauma bay, the military dog stopped watching everyone else and locked his eyes onto her. "Have you ever trusted silence more than the loudest voice in the room?" Emily took one slow step forward, then another, never looking directly into Atlas' eyes. Every pair of eyes in the trauma bay followed her instead. A security officer quietly shifted closer to the emergency exit. Someone reached toward the phone, already preparing to call off the exercise if the dog reacted again. Dr. Ryan Cole folded his arms with unmistakable confidence. "This ends exactly like the others," he muttered. Emily stopped nearly 8 feet from the bed and lowered herself onto one knee. She did not extend a hand. She did not whisper to the dog. She simply rested her left wrist lightly against her raised knee and waited. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. Atlas remained frozen for one long second, then another. Instead of barking, the Belgian Malinois tilted his head by the slightest fraction. His ears lifted. His breathing changed. Colonel Nathan Brooks noticed it before anyone else. "Nobody moves," he said quietly, his voice stopping every nervous impulse in the room. One young nurse ignored the warning and instinctively shifted her weight. The scrape of her shoe echoed across the polished floor. Atlas instantly snapped his attention away from Emily and back toward the movement, placing himself between the hospital bed and the entire room again. Hope disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Dr. Cole gave Emily a sympathetic smile that felt more like a dismissal. "Enough," he said. "He is protecting his handler. This is not about you." Emily never argued. Her eyes stayed on Atlas, not with challenge, but with patience. "The lights," she said softly. "Turn off the examination lamp above the bed." A technician frowned. "What difference would that make?" "Please." The hesitation lasted only a second before Colonel Brooks nodded. The bright surgical lamp clicked off, leaving only the softer overhead lighting. Atlas blinked twice. The muscles across his shoulders loosened just enough for Brooks to notice. Dr. Cole did not. "Coincidence," he said under his breath. Yet nobody laughed this time. Emily slowly shifted her weight without taking another step. Atlas watched every movement. Then, almost cautiously, he took one step toward her. Gasps rippled through the room. Sergeant Daniel Reeves remained unconscious, unaware that the military dog who had refused every trained nurse had just crossed the invisible line he had defended for the past 20 minutes. Emily did nothing to encourage him. She only remained exactly where she was, allowing Atlas to choose the distance himself. Colonel Brooks narrowed his eyes. That restraint was familiar. It was the kind of discipline handlers spent years trying to master. The dog stopped less than 3 feet away. His nose lifted slightly, testing the air instead of the person. Emily's watch was gone. Nothing covered the pale skin of her left wrist now except a faint, narrow mark that disappeared beneath the sleeve of her scrub top whenever she breathed. Brooks leaned forward almost unconsciously, trying to see it more clearly, but the fabric settled back into place before he could be certain of what he had seen. Atlas inhaled again, longer this time. Every sound inside the trauma bay seemed impossibly distant. No growl, no bark, no warning, just silence. Then the military dog began walking straight toward Emily, ignoring every command his own handler had ever taught him to obey. Atlas closed the remaining distance with slow, measured steps, but just as his nose came within inches of Emily's wrist, a nervous security officer instinctively reached for the dog's leash. The sudden movement shattered the fragile calm. Atlas immediately shifted sideways, placing himself between Emily and the reaching hand, his body tense again as low warning rumbles rolled through the trauma bay. "Nobody touch him," Colonel Nathan Brooks ordered, his voice cutting through the room before anyone else reacted. Emily did not retreat. She did not reach toward Atlas either. Instead, she quietly lowered her hand until her fingertips rested against her own knee, making herself even smaller. The warning sound gradually faded. Atlas watched her face for another long moment before turning his attention back to the exposed wrist she had made no effort to hide. Every heartbeat inside the room seemed loud enough to echo. Dr. Ryan Cole frowned. "He is still evaluating her," he whispered. "One wrong move, and this is over." Emily remained perfectly still. She waited until Atlas made the decision himself. The Belgian Malinois finally stepped forward, lowered his head, and gently pressed his nose against the inside of her left wrist. The change was immediate. His breathing slowed. His ears relaxed. The rigid military posture that had frightened an entire trauma team dissolved into something almost impossible to describe. Atlas released a soft, quiet whine unlike anything anyone in the room had heard since he arrived. Then, with complete trust, he rested the weight of his head against Emily's wrist as though he had been searching for it all along. Nobody spoke. Even Dr. Cole seemed unable to explain what he was seeing. Emily still did not touch the dog. She simply allowed him to remain there until his breathing settled into an even rhythm. Sergeant Daniel Reeves remained unconscious only a few feet away, yet for the first time the path to his bedside was no longer completely blocked. It was the first real breakthrough anyone had achieved that morning, but it raised a far more unsettling question than the problem it solved. Why had Atlas accepted one quiet emergency room nurse after rejecting everyone else? Colonel Brooks studied every detail with growing intensity. It was not simply trust. Military working dogs were trained to make distinctions most people never noticed. Atlas had not surrendered his protective instincts. He had chosen to redirect them. Emily slowly rose to her feet without startling him. Atlas immediately stood with her, matching her movement almost perfectly before calmly sitting beside the hospital bed again. Nobody had given him a command. Several nurses exchanged uncertain glances. The same people who had smiled minutes earlier now watched Emily with cautious respect instead of quiet amusement. Dr. Cole opened his mouth as if to argue, then stopped when he realized he had no explanation that matched what everyone had witnessed with their own eyes. Emily finally looked toward the unconscious soldier instead of the dog. Her eyes briefly traced the intravenous line, the cardiac monitor, and the oxygen tubing in one smooth sweep before returning to Atlas. "He is watching every hand that reaches for him," she said softly. "Do not approach from the front." No one answered immediately, yet without thinking, two nurses instinctively changed their positions exactly as she suggested. Atlas did not react. Another invisible barrier had fallen. Colonel Brooks took one slow step closer, his attention no longer fixed on the dog, but on Emily's left wrist. As the sleeve of her scrub top slipped back for only an instant, he caught sight of a narrow, faded mark circling her wrist. Not quite a scar, not quite a bracelet mark, but something strangely familiar that stirred a memory he could not yet place. Before he could look closer, Emily quietly pulled her sleeve back into place, and Atlas suddenly lifted his head toward her with another soft whine, as though he recognized something far beyond the scent of her skin. The communications officer lowered the tablet before anyone else could see the screen, but the overhead speaker interrupted before Colonel Nathan Brooks could ask a single question. Trauma Bay 1. Incoming critical military transfer. Arrival in 3 minutes. The entire emergency department shifted at once. Stretchers cleared the corridor. Blood products were requested. The charge nurse scanned the room, then looked directly at Emily. "Carter, I need another experienced trauma nurse in Bay 1. Emily glanced toward Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves. Atlas remained calm only because she was still within sight. If she stayed, the incoming patient might lose a trained pair of hands. If she left, no one knew whether Atlas would return to blocking the team. There was no perfect choice. Before she answered, Colonel Brooks quietly stepped toward the charge nurse. "Give us 30 seconds. He turned to the handlers instead. "Can anyone safely reach Reeves now?" No one answered immediately. Every eye shifted toward Atlas. Emily studied the Belgian Malinois for only a heartbeat before looking at the room instead of the dog. "Do not approach him from the front," she said calmly. "Use the opening on his left side. Leave the center clear." This time no one questioned her. A senior trauma nurse followed the route Emily indicated, stopping several feet from the bed instead of closing the distance immediately. Atlas tracked every movement, remained perfectly still, then slowly lowered his head again without another warning growl. The room exhaled together. Emily had not solved the problem herself. She had created a way for someone else to solve it. The charge nurse immediately pointed toward the trauma corridor. "Go. Bay 1 needs you now." Emily nodded once and moved without hesitation. Colonel Brooks watched her disappear into the hallway, but instead of following immediately, his attention remained on the dog. Atlas never looked at the nurse now treating Reeves. His eyes followed Emily until she disappeared around the corner. Brooks filed the detail away without a word. Down the corridor, the atmosphere felt completely different. Security officers secured intersections. Navy personnel waited outside closed doors. Every passing second increased the pressure before the incoming transfer arrived. Emily reached the trauma preparation room just as another nurse struggled to organize unfamiliar military equipment that had arrived with the alert. Without interrupting, Emily quietly separated the equipment into treatment order instead of unpacking everything at once, clearing valuable workspace before the patient arrived. The nurse looked up in surprise, then silently continued with the new layout rather than changing it back. Nobody praised the adjustment because the ambulance doors burst open at that exact moment. The incoming commander rolled through the entrance, surrounded by Navy operators moving with disciplined urgency. Emily instinctively stepped aside, creating a wider path instead of forcing herself into the center of the room. One exhausted Navy officer glanced at her only briefly before his eyes narrowed. It was not recognition. It was confusion. She had moved exactly where someone familiar with military casualty flow would have stood. Colonel Brooks entered the bay seconds later and noticed the same thing. Emily was no longer simply responding to emergencies. She was anticipating the movement of people she had never officially worked beside. Before Brooks could decide whether it meant anything, the commander was wheeled deeper into Trauma Bay 1. The automatic doors began sliding shut. Just before they closed completely, the unconscious officer's hand shifted once beneath the blanket, and the Navy lieutenant walking beside the stretcher abruptly turned toward Emily with an expression that replaced urgency with unmistakable suspicion. The Navy officer standing inside Trauma Bay 1 stared at Emily for only a second before stepping aside without a word. It was not permission born from familiarity. It was the instinctive reaction of someone who had just seen complete confidence where everyone else saw uncertainty. Emily crossed into the room as the trauma team worked around the injured commander. Vital signs continued to fluctuate. The lead surgeon spoke rapidly while another nurse reached for additional supplies. Emily did not move toward the operating field. Instead, she stopped near the foot of the bed, absorbing the room in one silent sweep. She noticed the ventilator tubing, the blood products waiting to be connected, the surgical trays, the exhausted faces, and finally the pair of tactical boots resting beneath a chair where someone had removed them minutes earlier. Her eyes paused for only an instant before returning to the patient. "We have minutes," the surgeon said. "If circulation becomes any less stable, we lose our chance to move him." Emily stepped toward the monitoring equipment instead of the patient. "Before you move him again, secure the lines on his left side," she said calmly. "If they shift during transport, you will spend precious seconds correcting them." Nobody argued because nobody had time. A nurse immediately adjusted the tubing. As the bed was repositioned, one line stretched exactly where Emily had anticipated. Instead of pulling free, it held securely. The room avoided a delay that could have cost valuable time. No one celebrated. The operation simply continued. Yet several members of the military escort exchanged brief looks. That prediction had not come from luck. Emily had seen the problem before it existed. Colonel Nathan Brooks remained near the doorway, saying nothing. He watched Emily the way an investigator studies a pattern that refuses to disappear. She never searched for attention. She searched for vulnerabilities. The Navy officer who had stepped aside earlier quietly approached Brooks. "Where did you find her?" he whispered. Brooks never answered because he did not have an answer himself. Then the unexpected happened. One of the medical devices emitted a sharp warning tone as a pressure reading changed unexpectedly. The room tightened again. The surgeon immediately considered delaying the transfer until another assessment could be completed. Every passing minute increased the risk. Every delay carried its own danger. Emily looked from the monitor to the patient's position, then toward the equipment beside the bed. "Do not stop," she said. "Check the transducer before changing the plan." It was a difficult choice. If she was wrong, precious time would be wasted. If she was right, stopping now would create an even greater risk. The technician quickly inspected the setup. A connection had shifted during repositioning, producing an inaccurate reading. Within seconds, the number stabilized. The surgeon gave a single nod. "Continue." The room moved again. No applause followed. Only faster hands and quieter voices. For the first time, the military personnel were no longer watching Emily because she had calmed a dog. They were watching because every important decision she made seemed to remove invisible obstacles before anyone else recognized them. As the transport team prepared to move the commander toward imaging, Emily instinctively stepped to the side of the bed, leaving the exact clearance needed for the escort detail to form around it without crossing one another's paths. One Navy petty officer stopped mid-stride, studying her with growing disbelief. "How did she know our movement pattern?" he murmured under his breath. Nobody answered. Emily had already turned away, preparing to return to the emergency department. Then the unconscious commander, who had not responded to anyone since arriving at the hospital, slowly lifted one hand just enough for his fingers to brush against the edge of Emily's sleeve before falling still again. Every person in Trauma Bay 1 froze. Colonel Brooks' expression hardened as though another missing piece had quietly fallen into place, and before anyone could process what they had just witnessed, An urgent call echoed through the corridor that Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves' condition had suddenly changed again. Emily was already moving before the final word of the emergency call faded. She left Trauma Bay 1 and crossed the corridor at a controlled run, Colonel Nathan Brooks and 2 military officers close behind. When she entered the original Trauma Bay, Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves was conscious but disoriented, his breathing shallow while Atlas pressed against the bed, blocking anyone who approached too quickly. The monitor showed a rising heart rate. One nurse held medication ready. Another waited for permission to sedate the dog. Emily saw the choice immediately. Calming Atlas would cost time Reeves might not have. Sedating him could destroy the only trust keeping the room under control. She stepped inside the dog's protective circle instead. "Easy 6, she said, barely above a whisper. Atlas looked at her wrist, then moved exactly 3 steps back and lay down. The military officers stopped in the doorway. That was not a hospital command. It was not part of the current handling protocol either. Emily reached Reeves and found the source of the change within seconds. His oxygen tubing had shifted during the earlier transfer, and panic was worsening his breathing. She corrected the line, raised the head of the bed, and spoke to him in short, measured phrases until the monitor began to settle. Reeves focused on her face. His expression changed from confusion to recognition, but before he could speak, Emily placed 2 fingers against his wrist and quietly told him to save his strength. The decision protected him, yet it also denied everyone else the answer they were waiting to hear. Colonel Brooks moved closer to the equipment cart. A worn military identification chain had slipped from beneath Emily's scrub collar while she leaned over the bed. The tag was turned backward, but the edge carried a stamped symbol Brooks had seen only in restricted casualty reports. He said nothing. Instead, he asked one officer to contact records and verify a unit designation without using Emily's name. The officer left immediately, and the weight inside the room changed. Emily was no longer being observed out of curiosity. She was being trusted with consequences. Reeves' breathing improved, but his hand tightened suddenly around her sleeve. "You came back," he managed. Emily did not answer. Her eyes moved briefly to Atlas, whose head remained lowered against his paws. The dog gave a faint whine, and Emily's composure faltered for less than a second. Not fear, grief. Then she gently released Reeves' hand and returned to the monitor. Dr. Ryan Cole noticed. His posture softened, but instead of offering praise, he handed Emily the medication tray and asked, "What do you need?" She chose the smallest dose necessary to control Reeves' distress without clouding his neurological examination. It was slower and more difficult than full sedation, but it preserved the information the trauma team still needed. Every person in the room followed her instructions without resistance. That new trust came with a larger burden. The coordinator from Trauma Bay 1 appeared at the doorway again. The Navy commander required immediate transfer, and the escort team would not move until someone confirmed the route was secure for both the patient and Atlas. Brooks looked at Emily. So did the surgeons. So did the military officers. She had become the only person everyone believed could keep both situations from collapsing. Before she could choose where to go, the records officer returned holding a tablet, his face drained of color. He showed the screen only to Colonel Brooks. Across the top, beneath a black restriction banner, were 4 words: Night Mercy 9 personnel. Brooks looked from the tablet to Emily's hidden identification tag, then toward Atlas. Only one name on the list had not been marked recovered, deceased, or officially accounted for. Colonel Nathan Brooks closed the tablet without saying a word because there was no time left for questions. Another urgent call came from Trauma Bay 1. The Navy commander had become unstable during preparation for transport, and the surgical team needed immediate assistance to complete the move safely before his condition worsened. Emily never asked what Brooks had just read. She simply turned toward the corridor. Halfway there she stopped, looked back at Atlas, then at Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves. "He goes where Reeves goes," she said quietly. "Keep the hallway clear. Do not surround him." It was not a suggestion. It was the only way to prevent panic during the transfer. Brooks nodded once, and without another discussion the military escort rearranged their formation exactly as Emily requested. The corridor transformed from confusion into controlled movement. Atlas remained calm, Reeves remained protected, and the trauma team reached Trauma Bay 1 without losing another minute. As the hospital staff guided the Navy commander toward the transport stretcher, one support rail shifted unexpectedly, forcing everyone to pause. Emily moved immediately, securing the patient's position while directing two nurses to stabilize the equipment instead of the bed itself. The adjustment took only seconds, but it prevented another dangerous interruption. No one needed to explain why she had made that choice. They had all watched the result. The transfer resumed smoothly. Only after the stretcher rolled safely through the doorway did Colonel Brooks finally speak. "Medical records," he said quietly to the officer beside him. The officer opened the restricted file again. There was no dramatic announcement, no speech, only a brief confirmation delivered in a restrained voice. "Former tactical medic. Night Mercy 9. Personnel status, presumed lost." Brooks looked toward Emily, the faded mark around her wrist, the identification tag hidden beneath her scrubs. The command Atlas obeyed without hesitation. The way she created space instead of force. The way she anticipated danger before it appeared. Every unexplained detail from the past several hours aligned without another word. Nobody in the room reacted with applause. Instead, every military member unconsciously stepped aside, giving Emily a clear path through the center of the corridor. She noticed the gesture but did not acknowledge it. Her attention never left the patients. Reeves' monitor signaled another change as he was prepared for observation. Emily crossed back to him immediately, checking his airway, speaking calmly, reassuring him that the difficult part was over even though she knew recovery had only begun. Reeves looked at her with tired eyes. "I knew that voice," he whispered. Emily gently adjusted his blanket instead of answering. Atlas walked forward on his own and rested his head against her left wrist once more, exactly where he had placed it the first time. This time no one tried to pull him away. The entire emergency department watched in complete silence. The military working dog was not responding to a sin alone. He was recognizing the person who had once earned his absolute trust. Brooks slowly raised his hand to his forehead in a quiet salute that lasted only a moment before lowering it again. None of the soldiers copied him because they did not need to. Respect had already filled the room. Emily simply stroked Atlas once between the ears, then returned both hands to caring for her patients. Her past had finally been acknowledged, but she refused to let it become more important than the people still depending on her in the present. As the trauma team prepared to move both patients toward the next stage of treatment, Brooks received one final secure message on his phone. The subject line contained only 3 words, "Night Mercy 9. The message beneath it was even shorter. "One survivor remains unidentified." The emergency department slowly found its rhythm again, not because the day had become easier, but because everyone had quietly begun moving differently. The nurse who had laughed earlier stepped around Atlas instead of trying to hurry past him. The respiratory therapist automatically silenced another rattling equipment cart before entering the room. Dr. Ryan Cole no longer issued instructions across the trauma bay. Instead, when he reached a difficult decision, he glanced toward Emily first, and when their eyes met, he simply nodded before returning to his patient. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. The lessons of the morning had settled into the department without a single speech. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves rested more comfortably as the medications took effect. Before being transported upstairs, he slowly lifted his hand toward Atlas. The Belgian Malinois touched his handler's fingers, then quietly looked back toward Emily, waiting. She gave the smallest nod. Atlas followed the stretcher without hesitation, walking calmly beside it through the crowded hallway. Nurses who had once stepped back in fear now instinctively cleared a wider path, not because they feared the dog, but because they understood what he was protecting. Colonel Nathan Brooks remained near the intersection of the 2 trauma corridors, watching the scene unfold. He folded the restricted tablet closed and slipped it into his jacket without opening it again. Whatever answers remained inside could wait. The people standing in front of him could not. As Emily turned to leave, Brooks stepped aside instead of stopping her. It was the same silent gesture every soldier in the hallway copied a heartbeat later, creating an open path without a single command being spoken. Emily thanked none of them because she treated it the same way she treated every patient who entered the emergency room. She accepted the moment, then kept walking toward the next person who needed help. At the far end of the department, an elderly visitor looked confused after becoming separated from his family during the morning's emergency activity. Emily knelt beside him, spoke gently, and guided him toward the waiting area before anyone even realized he needed assistance. No cameras followed. No military officer interrupted. Dr. Cole watched from across the hallway, quietly setting aside the paperwork he had been carrying so he could help reunite the family. The change spread without anyone announcing it. One calm decision became another. One act of patience invited the next. A few minutes later, Atlas returned with an escort after Reeves had safely reached intensive care. The moment the dog saw Emily standing beside the same supply cart where the morning had begun, he slowed to an easy walk. She removed one glove, just as she had removed her watch hours earlier, and rested her left hand naturally against her knee. Atlas approached without hesitation, lowered his head, and gently placed his nose against the faint mark on her wrist before closing his eyes for a quiet moment. The bustling emergency department continued around them, yet the small circle of stillness remained untouched. No commands, no applause, no words, only trust remembered. Emily smiled almost imperceptibly, stroked the space between Atlas' ears once, then reached for a fresh pair of gloves as another patient was wheeled through the ambulance entrance. She slipped the gloves on with the same calm hands that had begun the day in silence. Atlas watched her return to work before following his escort without looking back. As the automatic doors closed, the loose instrument cart near the trauma bay rolled slightly across the floor and gave the faint metallic rattle that had started everything. This time, before anyone else reacted, a young nurse quietly placed a folded towel beneath its wheel. The sound disappeared. The emergency department moved forward in silence. And so did the quiet nurse whose greatest victory had never been proving who she was, but reminding everyone around her what quiet strength truly looked like. Morning sunlight reached the emergency department before most of the night shift realized another day had already begun. The trauma rooms had been cleaned. Fresh linens covered every bed. The monitors spoke in their familiar rhythm, and ambulances continued arriving one after another, carrying strangers whose stories had not yet begun. Emily Carter signed the end of her shift with the same quiet handwriting she had used every other morning. No one gathered around her. No ceremony interrupted the hallway. She simply checked one last patient chart, returned a stethoscope to its hook, and paused beside the supply cart that had rattled so loudly only hours before. The folded towel remained beneath its loose wheel. A new nurse pushed the cart across the floor. It rolled silently. She smiled without realizing why. Across the department, Dr. Ryan Cole met an anxious family before entering an examination room. Instead of speaking first, he knelt beside a frightened little boy so they could meet at eye level. He waited until the child stopped trembling before asking his first question. Nearby, another nurse slowed her pace as she approached an elderly patient instead of rushing through the conversation. A respiratory therapist quietly adjusted a noisy piece of equipment before anyone complained about it. Small choices passed from one person to another without announcement, almost too ordinary to notice unless someone had witnessed the day before. Colonel Nathan Brooks walked through the corridor one final time before leaving the hospital. He stopped outside the intensive care unit where Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves rested peacefully while Atlas slept beside the bed, one paw stretched toward his handler even in sleep. Brooks reached into his pocket, looked once at the unopened secure message labeled Night Mercy 9, then locked the screen without reading another word. Some stories belonged inside reports. Others belonged inside the lives they quietly changed. He slipped the phone away and continued walking. Emily had already changed into a simple jacket and was preparing to leave through the employee entrance when she noticed a volunteer struggling to lift two heavy boxes of donated blankets. Without hesitation, she stepped over, picked up one of the boxes, carried it inside, and stacked it neatly where it belonged. The volunteer thanked her. Emily answered with a warm smile and a gentle, "Have a good day," before heading toward the parking lot. No one nearby recognized that the same hands carrying blankets had guided soldiers through impossible moments only hours earlier. They were simply the hands of a nurse finishing another shift. Just before Emily reached her car, The rear doors of a military transport vehicle opened. Atlas stepped down beside his new handler. The Belgian Malinois paused, lifted his head, and quietly searched the parking lot until he found her. Emily stopped walking. She removed one glove she had forgotten she was still carrying, folded it into her pocket, and rested her left hand naturally against her side. Atlas trotted over with calm confidence, gently touched his nose to the faint mark on her wrist one last time, then looked up into her eyes. Neither of them moved for a moment. There were no commands, no cameras, no applause, only the quiet certainty of two survivors recognizing each other without needing words. Emily softly brushed the fur between his ears. "Take care of him," she whispered. Atlas turned, returned to the vehicle, and climbed inside without looking back. Emily watched until the transport disappeared beyond the hospital entrance, then turned toward her own car as another ambulance pulled into the emergency bay behind her. She glanced once toward the sliding doors, slipped her identification badge back around her neck, and walked inside instead of driving away. Somewhere beyond those doors, another stranger was waiting for a quiet nurse who never needed anyone to know who she had been, only who she chose to be every single day.